Hello and welcome to a new video. Today I will be sharing with you my recipe and process for making gingerbread cookies. Now these are quite special for me. When I make these, which is usually 2 to 3 weeks before Christmas, it feels like the Christmas season has officially started. I think it has a lot to do with the aroma of these and specifically the spice mix that's in these. That's just so specific that I am instantly transported right underneath the Christmas tree. And it's just such an enjoyable thing for me to make. And I'm curious, do you have such a food that you make maybe before actual Christmas that kind of gives you this Christmas spirit? If you do, I would love to read about it in the comments below. So when it comes to the dough, I've shared all of the ingredients and the measurements in the description of the video, but I want to highlight a few things. The first thing I want to talk about is the spice mix. You will see me put this brown powder mixture into the flour. And as I said, this is what makes these Czech gingerbread cookies very special. So that spice mix can vary a bit, but usually the basis is cinnamon. And then in the one that I use, there is also coriander. There is star anise, allspice, cloves, anise seeds, nutmeg, and also fennel. Now you may have noticed that there is no ginger in these. So that's absolutely correct. We don't put any ginger into our gingerbread cookies. We also don't call them gingerbread cookies. Obviously, we call them perničky in Czech. And that name has nothing to do with ginger. So if you're used to the American version of gingerbread cookies and you try to make these, you might find them to taste quite differently. The other thing I want to mention is the honey. So we use honey in our gingerbread cookies, and the honey is what determines a lot the color of the dough. So the darker the honey, the darker the dough will be. So if you have a preference, then make sure you go for the right color of honey. It's also the amount of flour I found that can change the look, like how dark or how lightly colored they are. So that plays a factor into it as well. And then the very last thing I want to mention is these are sourdough gingerbread cookies. So I am putting my sourdough starter into it, which of course does change the flavor in some way as well, but I actually really love the combination, and it also means it has some additional benefits that come from the starter culture, let's say, or the bacteria in it. This is a completely optional step. You can just completely skip the starter, but that would mean that your ratios of the ingredients and specifically the amount of flour is going to change because the starter is quite sticky. So I then have to add more flour to make the dough a little bit less sticky. So if you're not using the sourdough starter, then you may not need as much flour in your recipe. Once I have everything mixed in the bowl, I then scoop it out and I do the rest of the mixing on my kitchen counter. And I'm adding flour as needed until the dough is less sticky. It's definitely not sticking to my hands. I mean, if I was kneading it very roughly, it would still stick, but like when I put my fingers on it, it's not sticking anymore. So that's how I know that I've added enough flour and I can wrap it up and put it in the fridge. And usually you do want the dough to be in the fridge for maybe like a day or so. And since, again, this has sourdough starter in it, I'm actually leaving it in the fridge for, I think it was about 3 days, just to give the sourdough starter a chance to work a little bit more. Once I'm ready to bake the cookies, like I said, a few days later, I take out a portion of the dough. I don't do the whole thing at once. I think this time I cut it into thirds, and that was just the right amount for the amount of surface I have available for this. And while the dough was resting on the counter to make it a little bit softer, I prepared my baking trays with the baking paper and also my cookie cutters, which I have quite a nice collection already, and every year I'm buying more and more. But one thing I want to mention here with the baking paper, you want to make sure that it fits well on your baking tray, meaning it's like laying flat on it. Because if it's lifting up anywhere, if any of the corners are lifting up or it's like rolling up or something, it's essentially going to lift up the cookies and then they won't be nice and flat, which mine turned, even though I was being so careful with the baking paper and everything, and they were very flat when they baked, somehow they ended up changing the shape afterwards. I don't know if it was during the cooling process. I guess it was then. I don't know. Next year, I will be even more careful. Then I'm taking the dough, using a little bit of flour again, just to work on it again and trying to get all of the bubbles out of the dough and just make it very nice and smooth. I roll it out onto the floured surface. Again, one thing I'm paying attention to is to make sure I'm not flipping the dough so that the floured surface is only on the bottom, because if you were to flip it, which I did last year, I have then realized that you could still see the flour once the cookies have baked. So this year, only keeping it on the same side, and I'm rolling it quite thin, I would say, at least thinner than I was used to. And this, plus the size of your cutters, like how thin you roll out the dough and the size of your cutters, is going to determine how many cookies you're going to end up having. I think you can kind of see the size of the ones that I have. And with this amount of dough and this thickness of the cookies, I ended up having like a good 120 pieces or something like that. A lot of cookies. So if you want less, or you know that you have maybe even smaller cutters or something like that, feel free to just split all the ingredients in half, and then you will have obviously less dough, less cookies to make. Now, when it comes to the baking, first thing you want to pay attention to is that you're cutting out pieces that are roughly the same size so that they bake for the same amount of time, because this is a pretty quick bake, and 1 minute can be a difference, or can mean a difference, depending on how different in size the shapes are. So use the same size on the same tray. And then for these bigger ones that I'm starting with, I then also made some smaller ones, but for the bigger ones, I baked them at 180 degrees for 8 minutes. I've experimented a little bit, baking a little bit more or a little bit less, and this ended up being the perfect amount for me and the way I like them, which is really quite soft and chewy. So if you want them to be a little bit harder, then of course, or maybe browner with like more of a crust, then bake them for a little bit longer. Now, as soon as I got them out of the oven, I have spread egg wash on them. You want to do this while they are still burning hot, which, yes, it means it's a little bit tricky. You don't want to burn your fingers, but you want the egg wash to basically cook on top of them, or to dry out, let's say, on top of them, and make them really nice, smooth, and shiny. Now, you could leave it at this, right? No decorating. They are delicious cookies to eat just like that. For me, the decorating is what this is all about. This is what I have so much fun with and what I so much look forward to, while also getting very frustrated doing it. So when it comes to the decorating, I find that there are two things that are of quite an importance. First one being the consistency of your icing, of the icing that you're using. So here is me making that icing, and here in the Czech Republic, we only use 3 ingredients to make it: egg whites, powdered sugar, and lemon juice. Or in my case, what I did, instead of like an actual lemon and squeezing out the juice, I bought this powdered citric acid and I just mixed it with boiling water, and then I used that. I've heard this as a tip, since you end up with just pure water, whereas when you're squeezing out the lemon juice, it could happen that there is like the little fibers or whatever you call it that might fall out of the lemon. So with the lemon, you need to be more careful to make sure that it's just the clear liquid that you're using to make the icing. Now, all of these things I'm saying, like, I know this is for someone like me who really cares and really wants to enjoy the decorating process, and I want to make these very delicate patterns. So that's why all of these things matter to me. If you're just, throwing a bit of a face on the cookie, or, just a few lines or something, you probably won't care as much about the right consistency or the right smoothness of the icing and the tools that you're using and so on. So this is for those of you that really want to go deep into this process. And so here you see me making 2 bowls of icing. This first one, which is what I'm going to use for like all of the lines essentially, and the small decorating, is of a much thicker consistency, although you don't want to be too thick either, because then it's again just harder to decorate with it because it dries out too fast and it makes all these pointy edges and it's just not ideal. Nailing that consistency is so important for the final result, and I'm still struggling with it. I still am not sure what it should look like in the bowl, and it's really hard to test this out as well. So this is the frustrating part for me, when I can't figure it out. And I hate figuring stuff out. I would rather just have someone tell me exactly what I need to do. And you might think, well, it's easy, just follow a recipe for the amount of ingredients that you need. But that is really difficult, since the egg white is not a consistent, definitely not a consistent amount, because every egg is different. And even if you were to measure or to weigh it essentially and have a specific weight, you still have a different texture to it depending on the age of the egg it came from. If it's, I believe, the older the egg, the kind of thinner the egg white is. And if it's really fresh egg, then the egg white is really like much thicker. So even if you got the measurements right, you could still end up with a different consistency at the end. I did put in the description below just roughly the amount of sugar that you will need for 1 egg white. But again, like, this depends on all of these things. So you just have to look at it and you have to see for yourself, experiment for yourself what works best. So that was the first one. And then the second icing I'm making is this icing that we use for like when we're pouring it over the entire cookie, and you want it to be a lot thinner because you want it to spread easily. But of course, again, not too thin. You don't want it to just run off the cookie, to the side. So again, just needs a very specific consistency there as well. But it is a lot easier to get to the right result, I feel like, than the first one, because it's just there is a wider range of what can work for this type of purpose. So I'm mixing those. And then the second important thing when it comes to decorating the cookies, I find, is the tool that you're using for decorating them. And I'm talking specifically when making the thin lines. So this year I've tried making these cones from, it's kind of like a baking paper, not exactly baking paper. It's a little bit thinner, slightly different type of material, but I was not happy with those at all. It felt like it was more effort to put them together and to kind of learn how to put them together. I am still showing you, if you're curious, how you could make them. So it was just a lot of, cutting the paper and then rolling it up, making sure they have the pointy ends. And then it was just not super easy to work with them. Like, they would get soggy after a little bit, and it was also very difficult to deal with any, like if any of the icing got stuck in the tip, it was so hard to fix that, to get it out. It was just, I didn't like that. So later in some of the clips, you will also see me using these plastic bags that already have the tip at the end. But if you want to make these thin lines and all the intricate ornaments, you do need a tip that's really quite small so that you're able to make the lines thin. So when I finally got to the decorating part, I first took a couple of these cookies and I took the thin icing, let's call it that, the thin and the thick icing. So I took the thin icing and I did the contours of some of these cookies. And then I let the contours dry on those. And then I've added the thick, the runnier icing, and I've spread it all over these cookies, and it worked really well. Like, it stayed really nicely within the lines that I've drawn, although like I could see a slight color difference between the two types of icing, but obviously like that's me looking at it in a very detailed way, and me being a very detail-oriented person, I can see that difference. I'm sure most people would never notice. And that was the end of it for me for day one. So when I'm actually recording this, I still have about half of those cookies to be decorated. But I feel like I've gotten the hang of it. So in the following day, while watching The Holiday, I tried working with the thin lines and just decorating some of the plain cookies, and that went relatively well, although I know I just don't know how to keep the icing good for the next day, because the first day it worked really quite well for all those contours. On the second day, it was just not the same. It was not the same consistency. Of course, I had to beat it again. Like, it did dry up a little bit, and I feel like maybe because it dried up, it then meant that there were the little crystals that formed in there that I was just not able to mix into it or to mix it well enough. And so it just kept blocking the tip of those cones that I was using for this, and I was very frustrated on that day. And then came the third day, so I went into one of the shops here and I got those plastic bags. I thought I would give those a try because I just didn't remember what I was using last year. So I gave those a try. They worked really well, and I actually made a completely new batch of that icing, which is, it does pain me to throw away almost all of the icing that I made the previous day. But also, this is something I was so looking forward to it, and I wanted to enjoy myself. So I was just like, you know what? Let's just make a new batch. We'll start from scratch, and hopefully it's going to work better. And it sure did. This was such a good day. decorating wise. I had so much fun. I was really able to go in there, go into the details. Now here's the thing. I know that these look probably better than what the maybe average person does with their decorating. But for me, I know that I can do so much better. And it's so frustrating for me to feel like I have the skill or I have I feel like I can do this with my hands. It's just those tools and the consistency of that icing that keeps kind of not making this possible. Like on this day, even though I felt really good, it was definitely better than the previous day, and again, better than last year, I still saw all these imperfections in the cookies, like some of the lines and some of the little points, like they were just too pointy. The icing didn't spread enough, like all the little dots, like they had the pointy ends to them. And yeah, I know people will tell me that these are amazing but do you know that feeling? Like you just know that you can do better and there is something external, let's say, holding you back, or you just can't figure out how to get the right in this case, the consistency of the freaking icing, right? I just don't know what consistency that is and how to achieve it so that I can work with it the way I know I can, like the way I know I could draw this. So it's kind of like, I feel like I'm getting there, I'm getting better, but also I'm still feeling a little bit frustrated that I just don't have that knowledge yet. Anyway, that was my little rant about the cookie icing decorating thing. I will put in a few more clips as well. I hope that you will enjoy watching me paint some of these. And like I said in the beginning, do let me know if you have that special Christmas food that you love to prepare. Maybe it's gingerbread cookies as well. Are you into the whole icing thing, or do you just do them without it? Are your kids involved? Like, I cannot wait for our child to be old enough to be able to do this with me. It's going to be so much fun. So that's just something I want to know if you have that. And I think I will end with that here. And I'll see you in my next video.